I think we can take for granted tonight the enormous impact the publication of The Conservative Mind has had on American intellectual and public life. After hundreds of reviews and 7 editions, The Conservative Mind made the tradition of American conservatism respectable. In so doing, it gave the very name conservative to a new movement of intellectuals, journalists, and politicians, mounting a resistance to the total state, abroad and at home, in defense of those permanent things of family, faith, freedom, and communal associations. In the early 1950s, as many of you know, leading liberal thinkers argued that liberalism was the sole intellectual tradition in America. The Conservative Mind 70 years ago this year changed all that. In the words of the New York Times, Kirk's landmark book gave American conservatives an intellectual, an identity and a genealogy. The intellectual and political landscape changed after that. The Conservative Mind and his 32 other books, including his works of fiction and the accelerating number of translations around the world of his writings, have cemented Russell Kirk's place as a widely recognized figure of great importance to the intellectual life of the 20th century. The editor of the New Criterion and the Kirk Center board member, Roger Kimball, recently wrote in the pages of the University Bookman, quote, "How many books find enthusiastic new audiences 70 years after their first publication? Precious few." By reasons of longevity alone, he said The Conservative Mind, as of 2023, a septuagenarian, is a classic. Kimball went on to contend that The Conservative Mind is not only recovered a neglected legacy of conservative ideas, but also trumpeted a conservative future. We have assembled a panel of thinkers who have considered deeply and strategically the future of conservatism, even at this relatively early stage of their careers. They come to the question of what the conservative mind means to a new generation from different disciplinary and professional directions, as you will hear. Each has sought to conduct a conservative defense of the permanent things, to renew our cultural and constitutional order, and each seeks to adapt the perennial principles and wisdom Kirk delineated to the circumstances of our time. Dr. Kirk frequently echoed his hero, Edmund Burke, to attest the rising generation, to embrace their obligations and redeem the time. Not by force of arms are civilizations held together, he wrote, but by subtle threads of moral and intellectual principle. Tonight we will explore some of those subtle threads of moral and intellectual principle. While many today are bent on pulling down what earlier generations built up, Dr. Kirk directed his voice toward the future when he said, quote, "I hope and trust many of the rising generation will find it satisfying to restore and redeem their patrimony from earlier times, and so save the world from suicide. That labor will require cleverness and courage. Some of you present here tonight may choose it for your vocation." And with that high exhortation, I want to introduce panel moderator Michael Lucchese and the panel to come up now. Know that after the panel, while they're coming up, former Michigan Governor John Engler will be making an important Kirk Center announcement I think you'll all be very interested in, and of course we'll all have time for lots of hospitality afterwards. To the panel now. Michael Lucchese is a visiting scholar at the Liberty Fund and a Krauthammer Fellow with the Tikvah Fund. He was a communication aide for U.S. Senator Ben Sasse. He's an alumnus of Hillsdale College and the Hudson Political Studies program. His writings on national security, the conservative movement, and the American founding has been published widely in a host of important outlets. More recently, he is the founder and CEO of Pipe Creek Consulting. Michael has read widely and deeply in the literature of conservatism, a fact I'm confident will be on display this evening. Over to you, Michael.
Is this on? Good. Thank you, Jeff, for that introduction. Thank you, Vice President Pence, for coming and speaking before the panel today. And thank you to the panelists for joining us. So I want to start off by saying The Conservative Mind is a book that changed my life. When I first read it, I think I was a freshman at Hillsdale College. It helped me discover a kind of conservatism that was more than just a set of political positions or ideological dogma. Instead, I think the thing that's really important about the conservative mind is that Dr. Kirk is articulating a view of conservatism that is really more a way of life. He sets the beginnings of conservatism with Edmund Burke and the reaction to the French Revolution. As Jeff was saying, modern ideologues are seeking to tear down the fabric of society. They're seeking to tear down our Constitution and replace it with something new, liberalism, utilitarianism, totalitarianism. And Edmund Burke is really the first great figure in the conservative movement, in the conservative mind, to stand up and offer something different, offer a defense of our patrimony. And I think looking back over the last 70 years, we can say that the conservative movement that was sparked by this book has conserved a great deal. We defeated the Soviet Union, we overturned Roe v. Wade. There have been a host of really great conservative victories. But at the same time, I think there's a sense that sort of permeates political life right now, that conservatism has somehow failed, that there's something defeated about conservatism, that it's not winning anymore. And I think that there are real reasons why people feel that way. I saw a statistic recently, the suicide rate in the United States has increased by 62% since 2007. Fentanyl is one of the leading causes of death for people between the ages of 18 and 44. Our enemies, Russia, China, Iran, are on the march right now in the world. And here at home, we have both a radical party that's trying to undo the conservative patrimony, the American heritage, whether it's on college campuses or K through 12 schools, and are really putting that under attack. And there's also a massive administrative state that's restricting our ability to respond to all these problems and others. And I think as we're looking back at the last 70 years, we have to be very honest about both the conservative movement's successes and failures. And I think that The Conservative Mind is a book that can help us do that for a lot of reasons. For one, I think that it reminds us that there are things that are permanent, right? Family, friendship, education. But beyond that even, I think we might say that conservatism, that thing, that cast of mind Dr. Kirk was trying to articulate in this book, that is one of those permanent things. Another thing that I think this book reminds us that's very important is the importance of the politics of prudence. Edmund Burke, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, talks about how political prudence is balancing between competing goods and lesser evils. And I think that that's something that a lot of the conservative movement has lost sight of, whether we're talking about this so-called post-liberal new right or the older, more libertarian-leaning parts of the right. And I think young people are very dissatisfied with the direction of the conservative movement right now. And for that reason, and the third and I think final reason why I think the conservative mind is really important right now, I think we need a renewed moral imagination. The conservative mind is really a series of biographies of great statesmen and thinkers from the Anglo-American tradition who we can look to as examples, as models for both political thought and action today. And that's why I'm so glad that we have our panelists here. Next to me is Elayne Allen, who is a doctoral student at the University of Notre Dame. She's also an alumnus of Baylor University and the Hudson Political Studies program. Then we have Dr. Christina Lambert, an assistant professor of English at Hillsdale College, who holds her PhD from Baylor and is also a fellow alumna of Hillsdale College. And lastly, we have John Wood, who's the national ambassador for Braver Angels, a syndicated columnist with USA Today, and a former congressional candidate in the state of California. And so with that, I will pass things over to Elayne to get us started.
Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you so much to the Russell Kirk Center for pulling this panel together. So you've probably noticed that a lot of commentators like to remind everyone how rare it is to find a smart young conservative. A recent Politico profile of a friend of mine, who I think is actually here tonight, Aaron Severium, noted the following, quote, "If you remember that being a young conservative is weird, and being an educated conservative is even weirder, then the people who are young, educated conservatives are really very weird." I think there's probably a lot of very weird people here tonight, if I had to guess. Maybe one reason the young and educated are averse to conservatism is quite simple. They assume that conservatives don't like to think. Minds that are fresh from college are usually brimming with an intellectual energy and enthusiasm for really big ideas. And when they look at conservatism, they assume that it's a stale political philosophy that protects old, withered, and sometimes even bad ideas. And at worst, they see a bunch of reactionaries who dislike any kind of change. And this might be true of some conservatives, but I would argue that thinking is actually quite indispensable to conservatism. So today I'd like to discuss something that we might call developmental conservatism, which draws out and elaborates on Burke's political thought, which, as we all know, is the foundation of Russell Kirk's political thought and plays a vital role in the conservative mind. I don't think developmental conservatism is a new theory or vision for conservatism. Instead, it's just meant to offer, in fresh terms, a description of conservatism's intellectual disposition. It tries to elaborate on the workings of the conservative mind, and I think it can help us think a little more clearly about the roles that tradition and reason play in conservatism's self-understanding. So I would say that developmental conservatism's key observation is that any attempt to freeze frame customs or to preserve traditions without ongoing reflection will only suffocate them. It suggests that gradually and through the efforts of many minds, received customs must be drawn out, scrutinized, cultivated, refined, and in a word, developed. This framework rejects reactionary impulses that cry for return without thinking about whether return is practical or even desirable at all. While conservatives certainly are wary of radical transformation, they also know that change is sometimes inevitable. They often struggle to articulate a role for change and when it can be salutary. One thinker in Kirk's pantheon of conservative minds is a Catholic saint, John Henry Newman, whom Kirk calls, quote, the master of philosophical conservatism in the Victorian age. Newman sets out a careful, in-depth treatment of how ideas change in his book, The Development of Christian Doctrine. His primary focus in the book is on the unfolding of Christian teaching and doctrine over time. But Newman also offers a general theory of how ideas develop in society, a theory that I think can help conservatives think through how customs and traditions unfold. For Newman, ideas are things that exist both in the minds of individuals and in communities. But neither can ever fully comprehend an idea. Over time, more aspects of an idea or tradition or custom become apparent. Newman explains that as a new doctrine emerges in society, it is compared with existing beliefs, opinions, practices, and philosophies. And through this sifting and comparative process, old views are reconsidered in a new light, and new ones become refined in both individuals and in society as a whole. Like Burke, Newman's account of development rejects the hubristic view of reason that would upend all existing custom. Newman sees the limits of individual reason and argues that concepts gradually unfold across minds and generations. For Newman, the more important an idea is, and the more complex it is, the more times and minds that are needed to examine it and draw out its implications. And in this way, I think a developmental conservatism is actually more faithful to tradition and traditionalism than a reactionary is, who merely wants to return to an old paradigm. Traditions are living, and their significance can never fully be drawn out or completely comprehended. A reactionary's blind deference to an old tradition actually degrades that tradition and limits it. Attempting to preserve traditions in amber will only kill them. Developmental conservatism is also cognizant of the fact that customs can conflict with one another, and that a sense of priority is needed to deal with clashing customs. Think, for example, of the competing principles at stake in the famous Supreme Court case Employment Division v. Smith. In this case, the rule of law and the free exercise of conscience are both at play, and both are deeply embedded in our political order, and yet the case requires a prioritization between these principles. And this brings us to the important role that intellectual virtue plays in developmental conservatism. In Newman's book, The Idea of University, he describes intellectual virtue as the ability to give proper weight to things in relation to other concerns and objectives. He contrasts this skill with the tendency to obsessively cling to a single idea. He writes, quote, "Men whose minds are possessed with some one object take exaggerated views of its importance, are feverish in pursuit of it, and make it the measure of things which are utterly foreign to it." Newman shows that someone who is single-mindedly committed to a particular idea without the nimbleness of intellectual virtue will aimlessly apply that ideal to all situations and create confusion and discord as a result. This describes trads of all kinds whose commitment to some old lifestyle or idea is so absolute that they ignore its feasibility and other goods that might compete with it. No matter how fun its online presentations might seem, tradwifing is not going to resurrect the 1950s. Sorry, guys. It's not going to bring back the gender relations we saw at that time. Since then, husbands and fathers have become more integral to family life, which is an improvement, I would argue, upon their former role as somewhat superfluous financiers of the home. But for Newman, equally in error are those who reject the influence of any kind of inherited knowledge. He writes, quote, "Those who have no object or principle whatever to hold by lose their way every step they take. They are thrown out and do not know what to think or say at every fresh juncture. The unencumbered traditionless individual proceeds blindly. He has no given framework, no point of reference through which to navigate the world. This state is completely unsustainable, and if held on to perpetually, it becomes perilous. Think of the character Stavrogin in Dostoevsky's novel Demons. Stavrogin rejects any sense of good and evil and begins to revel and delight in his shame when he commits wicked deeds. He sinks lower than an animal, becoming a sort of devil. We need traditions and customs, not just because they make us live well morally, politically, and culturally. They orient us to fundamental moral truths. Developmental conservatism situates customs within its broader scheme of inherited goods. It relies on intellectual virtue to evaluate its stock of customs so that it can prioritize them. Newman describes the characteristics of the virtuous intellect this way, quote, "The intellect which has learned to leaven the dense mass of facts and events with the elastic force of reason cannot but be patient, collected, and majestically calm, because it ever knows where it stands and how its path lies from one point to another." End quote. Perceptive individuals play a vital role in drawing out the meaning of an idea. This is what Kirk himself does in The Conservative Mind, and what many of the figures in his book do. They reflect upon received ideas about the nature of society, human nature, and the state. They re-articulate, reconsider, and renew inherited insights. Developmental conservatism with Burke is skeptical of metaphysical inventions that would upend enduring traditions, principles, customs, and ideas. It denies that a philosopher's novel pronouncements will achieve moral and political progress. It achieves with Burke, Newman, and Kirk. It acknowledges with Burke, Newman, and Kirk that individual reason has a limited range of vision. But it specifies a modest role for reason that is disciplined to be temperate, sober, meticulous, and charitable. A reason that gives custom its due weight without regarding it as inviolable or infallible or absolute. And a reason that regards traditions not as stagnant relics, but as treasures to be stewarded, refined, and developed over time. This equanimity is visible in Kirk's own work and many of the conservative minds he considers. One exception is Kirk's inclusion of John Calhoun's defense of minority rights, a defense that ironically overlooks the basic humanity and rights of a racial minority. But even Kirk's misguided praise of a figure as depraved as Calhoun, amid his more discerning and profound meditations, illustrates conservatism's refining nature, its ability not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Conservatism itself needs the leavening effects of time. It needs multitudes of minds to ponder, draw out, and occasionally correct it, which is what I think today's conservatives usually do in rebuking Calhoun. You might have noticed that developmental conservatism doesn't sound very political, and you'd be right. It isn't a political agenda. Instead, it is meant to remind conservatives that of their philosophical foundations that are easily lost in the heat of high-stakes public debates. These foundations aren't merely academic concerns. They shape how we make decisions and what ideas count as credible in the court of public debate. As Russell Kirk demonstrated to the world in 1953, the conservative mind is not a receptacle for dusty old ideas. It is a judicious force in public debate that shuns both reactionary instincts of the far right and the revolutionary impulses of the far left. It reminds us that conservatism can be a storehouse of philosophical insight. Not rationalism that ignores context and facts, but genuine prudence that heeds reality's complexities, tragedies, and even its hopes. Thank you.
I just want to start by thanking the Kirk Center for having me here this evening. I first read The Conservative Mind for a weekend at Mecosta, and have been back many times, hosted by the wonderful Annette Kirk. Everyone should go to Mecosta. I'm really honored to be here tonight to celebrate the conservative mind with some remarks on Russell Kirk, his friend, T.S. Eliot, and the imagination. So in the first chapter of The Conservative Mind, Russell Kirk writes, "Men of imagination, rather than party leaders, determine the ultimate course of things." Of course, as a professor of literature, whose occupation is the imagination, this is great news for me. But this also means that the literary epigraphs and poetic fragments that permeate the conservative mind are more than window dressings. Rather, they speak to Russell Kirk's fundamental belief that the imagination is a formative human faculty, and the idea that literature trains and shapes our imaginations and therefore our lives. Proof of fact, Kirk concluded the UK reprint of The Conservative Mind with the poet, playwright, editor, and cultural intellectual T.S. Eliot, changing the conclusion to and also the subtitle of the work we celebrate this evening. In his biography of T.S. Eliot, Eliot and His Age, Kirk describes Eliot's love of tradition as inherently conservative. But he also considers Eliot's innovative verse as integral to this vision. Kirk explains Eliot's poetry as exploring, quote, dogmas from within, and expressing ancient ideas and orthodoxy in fresh forms. This means that Eliot's groundbreaking poetics, sometimes insane imagery, and dense free verse are all integral to his conservative vision. So we might ask, if the conservative mind seeks to keep alive a given tradition, why then do we need fresh forms? Does this suggest that our past, our inherited wisdom isn't good enough? And what might these fresh forms look like? In the spirit of Kirk, who loved both T.S. Eliot and the imagination, we will answer these questions with images. Come with me to East Coker, one of Eliot's 4 quartets. The poem begins with an image of decay. Houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field, or a factory, or a bypass. Written during the Second World War, the falling houses of the beginning of the poem speak to spaces laid waste by war, but they might also communicate natural entropy and decay, or even societal decline. We have only to look to the wasteland to see how vividly Eliot recognized spiritual and physical decay in the 20th century. Or that sad excuse for a love song, where J. Alfred Prufrock walks dirty streets untethered to any kind of community or reality about his own questions or even his own body. For the sake of Prufrock and the denizens of the wasteland, we must rebuild. The poem continues. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires. The resources we have at our disposal are those we have been given, old stone and old timber. But the buildings are new, and the timber, a gift preserved from the land by generations, goes into a fire. It must be transformed. So again, we ask, why don't we just rebuild old buildings with our inherited materials? Why this transformative fire? Eliot, of course, answers with another image, this time of an open field. It's beautiful here. It's a summer night in the 16th century. There's live music. We've stumbled in at the height of a wedding feast. The figures we find in this field are whirling around us in a dance. Round and round the fire, leaping through the flames, or joined in circles, rustically solemn or in rustic shoes, lifting heavy feet in clumsy shoes, earth feet, lone feet, lifted in country mirth. The beauty of this image is the rhythm. They are keeping time in the dance, but also in relationship to the land they farm, the animals they tend, and most importantly, to one another. Their healthy, life-giving submission to human limits is the antithesis of dehumanizing patterns that destroyed the earth and bodies in the wasteland. Okay, we say, this is it. Let's build here. Let's just build this. However, the archaic language Eliot employs in this image signals one significant detail about this field. It's in the past. We cannot join this dance. The opening lines repeat, if you do not come too close, if you do not come too close. Some of Eliot's peers were trying to, quite literally, revitalize culture through folk dancing and a kind of nostalgic return to a previous historical moment. But some of these figures also connected this revitalization movement and decided that one pattern for this work was the blood and soil fascism of 1930s Germany. So Eliot's lines are a statement of fact. You cannot come too close, but also a warning. Do not come too close. We can learn from the rhythms of the past, fall in love with a seasonal way of living, but we can't return to the field. We can pick up some stones and timber here. That's all. Section 2 of East Coker brings with it a deeper cut, if you can imagine. Here, Eliot invokes the quiet-voiced elders, the wisdom of the ages. So I think of Homer, St. Augustine, Dante. I think of how we often put them out in front of us like shields to defend us from what may come. Eliot questions, had they deceived us or deceived themselves, the quiet-voiced elders, bequeathing us merely a receipt for deceit? Where does this pessimism come from? It comes from the very different nature of our life and times from the thinkers we admire. Eliot writes, the pattern is new in every moment. The great minds that we love and have learned from cannot precisely answer every question and dilemma we present, because the pattern and the problems and their particularities are new. So instead of pushing these thinkers out in front of us, excusing ourselves from the task of application and discernment, We must instead walk alongside of them, drawing from their wisdom as we apply it to our own times. This means learning from these thinkers, expanding them, applying them, and also critiquing them. It means building something new using inherited materials. And yes, this is a much more daunting task. And for this reason, we are told at the end of section 2, humility is endless. So we might ask, what do these fresh forms look like exactly? For starters, in a section 4 of East Coker, Eliot introduces us to the figure of Christ, but he's hardly recognizable. He's a wounded surgeon, elbow deep in the guts of surgery with bloody hands. He's a battlefield doctor Eliot's contemporaries would recognize deep in the thick of it. The requirements for his own healing work of the heart are unhygienic hands still bleeding from his salvific wounds that he plunges into the patient's body, our body. How's that for shocking fresh forms? In this section of neatly rhymed cinquains, Eliot writes one of his gorgeous, memorable one-liners. The whole earth is our hospital. Healing can take place anywhere, everywhere. Eliot makes good on this vision in a later drawing room drama, The Cocktail Party. Scholars didn't like it, but the people did. It was a Broadway hit, and that was the point. Eliot wanted to bring a living tradition to New York and London, showing popular audiences what healthy rhythms of life, like those in that distant field, might look like in their own century. And he does, with a catered feast, a healed marriage, a successful fertility ritual, and a modern martyr. I won't tell you anymore. Just want you to go read the play. This is Eliot taking the stones and building new buildings. Eliot says in East Coker, "For us there is only the trying, the rest is not our business." Kirk makes clear that Eliot was not a triumphalist. At the heart of the moral imagination is a realistic view of the depravity of the human being. However, too often this view of human depravity makes us pessimists about what is new instead of realists about ourselves and our work. It's not a call to stop creating. It's a call to be honest about our pasts and hopefully and humbly continue good work in the present. It's important to say in closing that Kirk didn't always love Eliot and his work. This poet that he learned to love and later wrote books about, and with whom he concluded this influential work we celebrate tonight. And this just makes me think that we too might be startled by the fresh forms and friendships that come about if we're unafraid to read new books and build new buildings. Eliot says in the final section of East Coker, old men ought to be explorers. A living tradition is a lot of work. It asks a great deal of us, and it takes strange forms like a wounded surgeon, a strange cocktail party, or something we have not yet imagined. Our new buildings ought to use the stones we've been given, but the ultimate shape of these edifices might surprise us. Or maybe we won't live to see their completed forms, because things made to last take a long time to build. Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say that it is very much a pleasure to be here with all of you. Jeff, it's wonderful to see you. Cecilia, Annette, it's always a pleasure to see you. And Elayne, Christina, Michael, it's a pleasure to make each of your acquaintances. Fairly remarkable to be here honoring the publication of a book which manages to capture within its bindings assorted representations of immutable, permanent, eternal truths that we can grasp in the philosophical abstract, but that express themselves in the evolving forms and contexts of the generations, the differing evolution, stages of evolutions of society, and the differing challenges that always wind up being the same thing over and over and over again. Conservatism standing up in a spirit that seeks to preserve those things that are true against those things that seek to innovate out of the context of what we understand to be true. It is a hard thing to explain in a world that is so focused in on understanding things through the narrow lens of the rational that we forsake the intuitive and the inherited. So what do I mean by that? Well, so I'll tell you guys a little bit of a story. This was, I guess, about a month ago or so, a few weeks ago. I live in South Los Angeles, born and raised in different parts of LA. South LA is a bit of many parts of it are a bit rough. South Los Angeles, erstwhile South Central, but that's home for me. I was driving around at about midnight or so. Don't ask me why. I had a hankering for a couple of tacos. I think I'd gotten into an argument with Mrs. Wood and decided that the front seat of my car was more comfortable than the couch, and so I went out for a bit of a spin. I got in line. There were a couple of cars ahead of me, but very quickly I realized that I probably wasn't going to get my $1.59 tacos anytime soon, because there was a man who was in an argument with the cashier. And I say argument, it was pretty animated. The man was shouting and sort of jerking his fists out of the window, and so I thought, okay, I'm not going to sit here all night, and so I slowly backed my car up out of the line, started to pull off, but then something took hold of me. I felt a little bit of an invisible tap on my shoulder. I wasn't eager to go home just yet, and so I pulled over into the parking lot. I could hear the man shouting, and I just thought to myself, I sort of believe in this idea that the spirit sort of vibrates, and I was in sort of, I thought I had problems at the moment, but when I saw this sort of exchange taking place, I thought, other people have bigger problems than me. Let me bring a little bit of a spirit of peace to the parking lot here, and if things get bad, maybe I'll call the police, maybe I'll employ my Braver Angels mediation skills. I don't know what I'll do, but I just get the sense I'm supposed to be sitting here right now. And so I waited a few moments as I hear this argument escalate. At a certain point, the cashier threatens to call the cops. The man pulls his car forward to leave. He sees me sort of leaning outside against my car, and he starts to explain to me what happened. I didn't ask him to, but he was upset. He was aggravated. And so, he told me, he said, that man threw a drink in my face. And I said, I said, why is that? He's like, I didn't want to pay, but it doesn't matter. I was like, well, okay. And so, the man, I humor him for a second, but then the man hooks left, starts to drive out through the parking lot. But as he's leaving, he catches sight of the cashier through the window once again. And he starts shouting at him once again. I don't think the guy can hear him. The man is in his car in the parking lot. The glass doors are closed, but through the glass doors, he can see the man walking on the inside of the store. And he's threatening him with violence. He's saying, I know so-and-so. I'm going to have so-and-so come by and take care of you, yada, yada, yada. And as I'm looking at the man, he's about, early 50s or so, black man in an area that's predominantly black and Latino. And it occurs to me that I probably know something about this man's story. And so something, again, gets into me. I feel a little bit of a prod, a little bit of an invisible push. And as he's shouting at the jack-in-the-box worker through the window, I walk over to his car, and I say to him, I say, brother. And he looks at me a little bit surprised, because now I'm approaching him. And I say to him, where are you from? Now, the question, where are you from, is a potentially provocative question in certain places. Because, where are you from is a question that might be suggesting, what part of the hood are you from? What street are you from? What set or, what gang do you associate with? So on and so forth. When somebody pulls up next to you randomly in the streets and says, where are you from? That's a reason to tense up, much of the time. And so he tensed up, as I thought he might, and he kind of looked me up and down. He said, what do you mean, homie? He said, I'm from Compton. And I said, okay. And he said, where are you from? And I said to him, truthfully, I said, I'm from Inglewood, I'm from South LA, but I'm also from Gallatin, Tennessee. I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I'm from Texas. And as I started to go through the southern states of my lineage, his face started to change and soften, and I put my hand on his shoulder, sort of squeezed him warmly a little bit, and so I said to him, so again, brother, I said, where are you from? And he kind of nodded his head for a second, and he said, Arkansas, said Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas. And we kind of nodded our heads together for a second. See, if you know a little bit about the history of Black Los Angeles, what you'll know is that there have been a couple of migrations of African Americans to the West Coast over time, all of them originating in the South, and the largest portion of that migration happening in the run-up to and in the aftermath of the Second World War. Black people migrated from the South to Los Angeles to work in the munitions factories in places like Watts and elsewhere. The Black experience in inner-city Los Angeles, as it has been the case in Chicago and other urban centers in America, has been an experience rife with a great deal of pain. And we could talk about gang violence and drugs and underserving social welfare programs, the corruption of the bureaucracy and all of these things. But the perhaps most poignant pain point of migration to America's cities was the degree to which much of our culture and heritage and customs and norms and sources of veneration were left behind, although that Southern culture still exists in inner city Los Angeles and inner city African American communities. And so I had an inkling that this was a man who he was either from the South originally, or he had parents and grandparents who told him stories of the South. And I wanted him to remember his grandmother. I wanted him to remember Sunday dinners. I wanted him to remember the pastor. I wanted him to remember the deacons. I wanted him to remember the things that would have grounded him in a different sort of standard for being and conduct that goes beyond the crass sort of materialism and ego-driven violence and fear and anxiety that grips so many of us in life in the city. But I couldn't do that without appealing to his sense of heritage, a sense of heritage that was still there, even if everything in his environment were pushing against that, right? This is part of the truth that the conservative mind reminds us of and preserves in our understanding of that which animates the spiritual unity of civilization. In this country, left, right, center, black, white, urban, and increasingly country folks too, we have become detached from our heritage as more than abstract facts in history books, because we have become detached from our traditions, we have become detached from our religions, we have become detached from the inner life of virtue that is cultivated through not just the correct sort of litmus test of voting and political positions, but the deliberate cultivations of the sensitivities of the spirit which allow us to show up to situations, civic, social, and familial, in our lives in a spirit of honor and a spirit of dignity, with a reverence for prudence and a capacity to be able to respect and engage honestly with differences of opinion that exist in a democratic society that nevertheless does not discount the fact that we are all of us made in the image of God, because that is our starting point when we believe that we exist in an ordered universe. We have lost the sense that we exist in purpose. And those of us who try to find our purpose in politics without reference to the larger design of the Lord fail to realize the fact that the expediencies of the political moment are not what ground us in a capacity for preserving the things that are good and true. It is faith and belief in the idea that truth cannot truly be crushed to the ground, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. We can be patient and wait for the Lord to move society through us, because ultimately the rush towards innovation, towards building things that are not set upon the firm foundations of tradition, find themselves crumbling in the end anyway. And who but those who till the soil of tradition are left in place to be able to build back up the edifice of society in ways that allow it to endure past the calamities of innovation? We have to remember what we have inherited, what we are descended from as a nation. We are in a moment where, if you look out across the landscape of social and political activism in this country, the zealotry that may seem so frightening on the activist left and the reactionary right, as you might put it, in different places, if you listen to it closely, you can hear an agonizing yearning for some spiritual context of meaning and a reclaiming of a sense of heritage in a society that is rich with rights and materialism, but poor in spiritual content. When I read Ta-Nehisi Coates, when I listen to social justice activists on the left make frequent reference to the ancestors and continuing the work of equity and justice in a way that connects them to the experiences of the slaves. Sometimes that's ridiculed and poo-pooed as identity politics. I may not agree with their political and social conclusions, but I hear the yearning for heritage. I hear the yearning to be reconnected to a sense of ancestry that many people feel has been lost on the left. That radicalism may yet be appealed to by a conservatism that does not reduce itself to a mere idolizing of individualism and liberty disconnected from virtue and inheritance, but one that actually is in a position to honor heritage because it remembers what conservatism really is. When I look at folks on the reactionary right calling for a white ethno-state and these sorts of things, to me that is un-American, but I can also hear within it a natural human striving to be connected to the past, to the things that anchor us in who we are. If the conservative mainstream in America does not appeal to the spiritual void in the American people, nothing we say about taxes or regulation is going to fill the holes in the soul that would allow people to motivate people to tear down the edifice of our society just to be able to fill a little bit of meaning in their lives. But because we have forgotten the tradition outlined and captured and preserved in the writings of the conservative mind, we are not in a position to speak to that spiritual void in America. But we could be, if we were to take seriously what your husband left us as a legacy and what he received as a net, as a legacy from the timeless thinkers that he captured in the conservative mind. This manner of conservatism is positioned to speak to the spiritual hollowness of life in America and may yet be the answer with respect to how it is we unite the American people around something deeper than our mere political and tribal grievances. And that's what I pray the work of the Russell Kirk Center in Washington, D.C. and beyond helps us to accomplish. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you so much to the panel. All three of you, is this, yeah, it's on. All three of you gave very, very beautiful remarks, and I'm very grateful for everything that you guys said. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and so I'd like to start with Elayne. My question is pretty straightforward, perhaps deceptively so. If Dr. Kirk had lived long enough to write an 8th edition of The Conservative Mind, who should he have listed instead of Calhoun, and what would that person have to teach us about this developmental conservatism that you're articulating?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of great people who I think kind of get at the spirit of developmental conservatism. One person that comes to mind is an author in the late 19th century, Edith Wharton. And I don't think many people think of her as conservative at all, because she, in many ways, wasn't. But I have in mind her book, The Age of Innocence, which is just a really incredibly shocking, beautiful, and like surprising book. And I won't give it away, but basically the story of it is of a man who's engaged to a woman, but the social forms of their time are very constraining, and his fiance is following all these scripts, and it's not very exciting. And then all of a sudden this like beautiful European exotic woman comes along, and you think he's gonna leave his fiance and then wife for this woman who he wants to have an affair with. And but he ultimately doesn't. He stays with his wife and fiance. I guess, sorry, I just ruined the book for you. You should still read it, but it just shows that I think like traditions can become stale, but they can also be renewed, and it's just a really complex, beautiful work of literature that I think doesn't sort of cater to like blind reactionaryism, which is what I'm really trying to talk conservatives off the ledge of. But it's also not progressive. It articulates, I think, what Russell Kirk and Burke and all these great minds have been advocating for centuries.
Thank you. Christina, in T.S. Eliot's little book, Christianity and Culture, he recommends that people interested in social renewal should start with parish and local community life. Dr. Kirk was a great advocate of localism. Of course, we've seen Mecosta, the community that he built there. But I also think that you rightly sort of suggest that there's a way in which these local communities can become problematic. They can become idols even, maybe. And so I'm wondering, how can we sort of hold both our devotion to the local, our devotion to the particular, how can we hold that together with a respect for universal principles and human dignity?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I was just reminded tonight as we were looking at the pictures of the Kirk Center and of Mecosta that it is really beautiful that this is located in a location and a place that you can go to, and there is something different about reading Russell Kirk's works in his library and discussing it there, because it's rooted in something local and real and in a place, and the community is extending with every group that visits that place. And it inspires you to go and create spaces like that, and to say, oh, we could have conversations like this in other libraries, and to build communities. And at its best, local culture is never finding one spot and saying, okay, that's it, that's the answer. It's saying, wow, these principles can be done in my hometown, in my school, in my college, and I can go build this and be a part of it. And, you know, at the heart of it for Kirk and for Eliot, it's saying that it's not a top-down approach, it's from the bottom up. And Eliot's an interesting example because while he loved agrarianism and localism, and he kind of thought like maybe a return to the farm is the answer, eventually he just says, well, I'm just gonna live in London forever. So I'm not gonna return to the farm. But that's actually important to note. He doesn't say, oh, well then those principles aren't right. He says, well, what did that look like in London? And that's why he writes The Cocktail Party and tries to apply all these principles to a group of people at a, fancy cocktail party. And they have a catered dinner. It's not a farm table dinner. But he's showing what renewal might look like in our lives. And so while local culture might look like, going off into rural areas, it's not one particular place, it's about principles. It's about renewal from, like I said, the ground up. It's about being connected to the fact that we have bodies and our food comes from somewhere, and it's about connections to real human relationships. And just the last thing I'll say is, I was looking back through the principles of conservatism that Kirk lays out in the first chapter in the intro, and One of them is about this, infinite mystery and complexity of human beings. And the best of local culture is looking at our neighbors and saying, you're a mystery to me, right? You are infinitely complex. And that's also at the heart of just the goodness of local culture. And that could be done on a farm, in Anacostia, Michigan, or in DC.
Thank you, Christina. John, I think that sometimes when people hear conservatives of a Kirkian cast of mind talk about the politics of prudence or moderation, they can often think of this as sort of limp-wristed or weak or ineffective somehow. It's not securing victory for conservatives. So when you're thinking about the politics of prudence and when you're thinking about depolarization, how can we best both pursue real political goods, a victory in election, let's say, but also pursue a common good that will sort of bring people together and reunite Americans?
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Michael. I'm not sure if I can come at it from exactly the frame that you're putting forward, but let me do my best to offer an answer here. Russell Kirk wrote of Edmund Burke that Edmund Burke elevated the sort of what you might see sort of the mundane quality, political quality of prudence to a high virtue, right? And of course, it was in embodying prudence that Burke was able to hold the ground against some of the shifting sands of revolutionary fervor that were boiling up in his own time. Now Burke, I suppose, had a fair enough political career, but the interesting thing about the conservative mind is that for the most part, Kirk talks about Disraeli and others, but to the extent to which he's talking about politicians, he's talking about many people who spend a great deal of time losing. The conservatives in the conservative mind frequently lose the political battle of the moment. And what Kirk is valorizing oftentimes is the necessity for standing up for lost causes, right? But it's not merely a vanity sort of thing, right? And so this is part of the longer view that Kirk calls upon us to take. And it's not an easy fit with sort of, the political expediencies of the moment. We were just joined by Vice President Mike Pence. Mike Pence just concluded his primary campaign for President of the United States, and he did not do particularly well. He didn't make it to the first primary. Mike Pence, however, to offer my own opinion here, as much as you can attribute a single action to a single man in the history of American politics in a single moment that managed to preserve the functioning, the integrity of American democracy, averting what had the potential at least to metastasize into an existential constitutional crisis for this country. If you can point to one politician in American history who did a thing like that in a single moment, it would be that man who just walked out of the room. You asked me the question, Michael, how does prudence unify and win? I'm not sure prudence unifies in the moment that it does win, but I do know this, in the fullness of time, for those who haven't caught up to the plot yet, Mike Pence will be validated and honored across the political spectrum for the courage that he showed on that day and the valorous prudence that he exhibited, and that is unifying. Because he stood upon virtue and faith, and he showed the best in the human character in a moment in which it mattered most. Left and right, that is inspiring. You just may not be able to see it in the passions of the moment, but we feel that vindication rising. And in the fullness of time, the things that are really true do bring us together. But we have to be willing to see the story play out. And so that's my answer.
Thank you so much, John. That was really well said. I want to say just a little something in closing, somewhat related to that. I'm certainly not the only person whose life has been changed by the conservative mind. Another person who I know that Vice President Pence also really admires had an experience like that, President Ronald Reagan. And in 1982, in this very room, in fact, President Reagan gave a speech in which he talked about the influence that Dr. Kirk had on him. And he said, "Only a short time ago, conservatives filled this very room for a testimonial dinner to a great conservative intellect and scholar, author of The Conservative Mind, Russell Kirk. In a recent speech, Dr. Kirk has offered some political advice for the upcoming elections. He said, now, more than ever, we must seek out the gift of audacity. We must not become too comfortable with our newfound status in Washington. When the walls of order are breached, he said, the vigorous conservative must exclaim, 'Arm me audacity from head to foot.' It was Napoleon, master of the huge battalions, who once said, 'It is imagination that rules the human race,' and Disraeli, who mentioned that success is the child of audacity." Reagan and Dr. Kirk's traditional conservatism, I think, can still be a model for this rising generation. No, as Eliot would remind us, we cannot revive old factions, we cannot restore old policies, or follow an antique drum. Rather, we should look to figures such as Eliot, Reagan, and Kirk because they provide models of thought and action to resist the gaping maw of revolution. It seems to me that conservatives still need that audacity. If we believe the permanent things are worth defending, if we believe that American order deserves to be upheld, if we believe that our heritage is worth passing down to a new generation, we must be audacious and bold. We must be willing to confront the hard realities of our times, but we must not lose faith in those principles and ideas which bind us to our ancestors. Thank you.